The fuselage screams as jagged 12 souls vanish instantly as the tail section breaks into the abyss. The pilots believed they were over Chile, but the mountains knew better. On October 13, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 carried 45. Most were young rugby players from the Old Christians Club. Athletes in the prime of their lives, now hurtling toward a frozen grave at 11,710 feet. When the Fairchild FH-227D struck a hidden ridge on the Glacier de las Lágrimas, the impact was catastrophic. Both wings were sheared off like paper, and the tail section, carrying the galley and the remaining fuselage, suddenly transformed into a high-speed sled, plummeted down the inside. The force of the deceleration was immense. Rows of seats were ripped from their floor tracks and propelled forward, crushing those trapped against the cockpit bulkhead. When the wreckage finally ground to a halt in the deep, powdery snow, the silence that followed was heavy with the scent of aviation fuel. The survivors, who initially climbed out of the mangled debris, found themselves in a lunar landscape of ice and jagged stone, 3,570 meters above sea level. They were stranded in the heart of the Andes, beginning a trial of endurance that would force them to confront the very boundaries of mortality in what is now known as the dead zone. This was not just a plane crash. It was on the afternoon of October 12, 1972, the twin turboprop Fairchild FH-227D took off from Montevideo with 45 people on board, mostly members of the Old Christians Club rugby union team from the affluent Carrasco neighborhood. Their destination was Santiago, Chile, for an exhibition match. But the merciless weather of the Andes intervened early, forced to ground the plane in Mendoza, Argentina. The crew and passengers waited for the conditions to clear. This delay was the first link in a chain of catastrophic events. The aircraft itself was a primary factor. The Fairchild FH-227D was known to be underpowered for high-altitude Andean crossings when fully loaded. Unlike modern jets that could soar far above the weather, this plane required pilots to navigate carefully through specific mountain passes, literal corridors of safety carved between the stone giants, rather than flying directly over the peaks. Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, a pilot with 29 previous crossings, was in the cockpit, but it was his co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Lágrimas, who was at the controls for the final leg. As they departed Mendoza on Friday, October 13th, at 3:12 p.m., the weather remained precarious, with thick cloud cover obscuring the jagged terrain. Relying on instrument flight rules, the pilots navigated by dead reckoning, a method of calculating position based. They were aiming for the Planchon Pass, a lower altitude gateway through the mountains. However, as they turned west, they encountered fierce headwinds that significantly hindered their ground speed, a variable that remains invisible to a pilot flying through a whiteout. But there was one detail in the navigation logs that didn't make sense, and no one noticed it yet. Lágrimas mistakenly believed the aircraft had already overflown the Chilean town of Curacao. Based on this fatal miscalculation, he reported to air traffic controllers in Santiago that they were ready to turn north, and he was, in reality, still miles away from safety, positioned direct. When the Fairchild banked and began its long slide down through the clouds, the pilots weren't descending toward a runway. They were diving into a labyrinth of granite. By the time the clouds parted, the sight through the cockpit windows was not the green valleys of Chile, but the towering, blackened ridges of the high Andes. It was a classic case of controlled flight into terrain. The thin air at 11,710 feet offered no lift for their struggling engines as the pilots desperately pulled back on the yokes, trying to clear a ridge that was already too close to escape. Within seconds, the Fairchild's wings would be shorn off by the peaks, leaving the fuselage to plummet toward the Glacier of Tears. Standing at 11,700 feet, the survivors were trapped in. There is no life here, no plants, no animals, only the blinding white of the Andes and the thin, oxygen-starved air that makes every breath a labored effort. For the first week, they lived on a meager supply of chocolate, crackers, and a few bottles of wine found in the wreckage. Adolfo Fito Strauch used his ingenuity to create a solar water melting system using aluminum sheets from the seat frames, a vital invention as dehydration was just. But on October 21st, the 11th day of their ordeal, the small speaker transistor radio they had managed to repair delivered a blow more devastating than the crash itself. Through the crackle of the static, they heard a news broadcast from Santiago. The search for the missing Uruguayan aircraft had been officially called off. They were now the only ones in the world. But there was one grim reality hidden in the wreckage that no one was yet willing to speak aloud. The realization that no rescue was coming shifted the group's dynamic from waiting to surviving. With the meager rations completely exhausted and their bodies beginning to consume their own muscle tissue, the conversation turned to the unthinkable. They were Roman Catholics, young men from the old Christians' club, guided by a deep faith that now faced its ultimate test. In a pact of mutual sacrifice, they discussed the necessity of anthropophagy, consuming the flesh of those who had already perished. They framed this horrific necessity through the lens of their faith, likening the act to a form of spiritual communion. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino took on the heavy burden of the initial processing, ensuring the others could distance themselves from the physical reality of what was required to stay alive. Every day became a cold calculation of calories and spirit. They slept huddled together in the broken shell of the fuselage, using the sub-zero atmosphere as both a preservation chamber and a prison. This was not a choice made out of madness. It was a collective, rational agreement to honor the dead by continuing to breathe, transforming their crash site into a laboratory of human On the 17th night, October 29th, the mountain struck a second blow that nearly extinguished the Society of the Snow. As the 27 survivors slept packed tightly inside the frozen aircraft fuselage for warmth, a massive avalanche thundered down the slopes of the Glaciar de las Lágrimas. In seconds, the cabin was filled with suffocating packed snow, burying the survivors alive in total darkness. Nando Parrado woke to the weight of the mountain pressing against his chest, unable to move a single limb. While some managed to dig themselves out and frantically clawed at the snow to rescue their companions, 8 people could not be reached in time. Among the dead was Marcelo Pérez del Castillo, the captain of the rugby team, and the man who his loss was a psychological hammer blow, forcing the survivors to reorganize their fractured leadership while living for 3 days inside the buried fuselage, breathing through small holes poked into the snow ceiling with metal pipes. Everything they believed up to this point was wrong. By early December, the situation reached a breaking point. Infection and malnutrition claimed more lives, including the final. His passing left only 16 survivors and served as the final catalyst for an impossible mission. On December 12th, Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin began the final trek toward the west, into the vertical peaks of the high Andes. They carried with them a vital piece of improvised engineering, a large 3-person sleeping bag, hand-sewn from the Fairchild's waterproof insulation and copper wiring salvage from the heating system. This crude barrier against the sub-zero nights was their only hope for survival as they moved away from the shelter of the fuselage. For 3 days, they climbed near vertical walls of ice until they reached the 15,000-foot summit of a massive ridge. Instead of the green valleys of Chile they expected, they were met with a sight that broke their hearts, an endless sea of jagged snow-capped peaks stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. They were not at the edge of the mountains. They were in the Vicentin was sent back to the crash site to preserve the remaining meat rations for the others, leaving Parrado and Canessa. They hiked for 10 days, covering over 61 kilometers of the most treacherous terrain on Earth without professional climbing gear or oxygen. They followed the roar of the Rio Azufre, moving closer to the snow line with every agonizing step, their bodies reduced to skin and bone. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. The silence of the valley was finally broken on December 20th, 1972, not by the roar of an engine, but by Sergio Catalan, a Chilean arriero moving his cattle, stood across the rushing waters of the Rio Azufre, staring at two gaunt, skeletal figures emerging from the mist. Nando Parrado, having hiked 61 kilometers through the highest peaks of the Andes, took a piece of paper wrapped around a stone and threw it across the divide. The note was a desperate cry. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. In the plane, there are still 14 people." Within hours, the news of their survival rippled across the globe like a shockwave, a staggering contradiction to the world's assumption that all 45 souls on Flight 5. On the morning of December 22nd, two Chilean Air Force Bell helicopters fought the thin, turbulent mountain air to reach the crash site at 11,710 feet. Led by Parrado, who pointed the way from the cockpit, the rescuers descended upon the shattered fuselage on the Glacier of Tears. 6 men were evacuated that first afternoon. The remaining 10 were forced to spend one final restless night on the mountain with medical personnel before being rescued on December 23rd. They were carried down to hospital beds in Santiago, where the gravity of their ordeal began to surface. The 16 survivors had endured 72 days in a dead. The media firestorm that followed their admission of anthropophagy was intense, yet it was met by the survivors with a profound, quiet dignity. They had formed what they called the Society of the Snow, a community bound by a pact that if one died, the others would use their body to survive. This decision was eventually met with compassion and systemic absolution by the Catholic Church, which ruled that their action. Today, the legacy of the Old Christians Club lives on through the books of Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, and the definitive accounts in Society of the Snow. Every year,